Hello everyone. In class we have been looking at two forms of bone formation known as ossification. The first model we looked at was intramembranous ossification, which is how flat bones of the body form. In class you were looking at this image and you were answering these questions that kind of go along with it. I wanted to make sure that we're clear on what's happening in this particular image. That being said, I am going to explain this to you, but I may not necessarily cover every single detail in these questions that follow. However, listening to my explanation, you should be able to answer these questions, which you would then have a better time creating those flowcharts that I'm looking for you to create that you'll then be posting up to Flipgrid. So I'm going to start in step 1. We can see mesenchyme cells indicated by our legend down here. They're spaced out in a matrix of bone. Recall the matrix is the space between cells. And in bone tissue, it's usually or largely calcium deposits. And we can definitely see that these mesenchyme cells, they're spaced out. They're not touching. They have their own space. As time passes, the mesenchyme cells, some of them stay separated out, but some of the mesenchyme cells, they start to aggregate or clump together. At this point, we can see that these mesenchyme cells are now filled in red. So checking out the red part, we can see that that indicates that the cells are now osteoblasts. So these are a different type of bone cell. So in this one picture, I see two different types of cells, mesenchyme cells, which are a precursor to connective tissues, and I see osteoblasts. And osteoblasts, they secrete prebone, and that prebone ends up becoming calcified, and then that calcified prebone becomes bone matrix. So I see these osteoblasts, they are aggregated, and then step 3, they start to secrete that prebone. Now the prebone, it is made up of collagen fibers, and we can kind of think of it as being cartilage in nature. So that cartilaginous prebone secreted by the osteoblast, it now is starting to become calcified. And as it's doing that, we start to see this formation of this red substance. And if we look down in our legend, it's identifying that as bone tissue. As these osteoblasts continue to secrete prebone, which then becomes calcified, which then becomes bone, we start to see that it's kind of grown outwards, but then it kind of has stopped. I don't see any more osteoblasts. This is called an island of bone, and it continues to grow outward and expand. As this happens, more and more new ossification centers form. Well, looking at this image, I don't exactly know what an ossification center is, but I can allude to it being another one of these, because it's talking about new ones forming. This one had been formed already. This one I can see something new is forming. This must be the ossification center. So we can then derive at the conclusion that the ossification center is these osteoblasts secreting prebone, which then becomes calcified, which then becomes bone, and then it continues to expand outwards, forming more and more islands, as we see in step 5. Step 5, I now see two islands that have formed. I see that the mesenchyme cells, they have moved to the edges of the bone, and I see that these islands, as described in 5, they start to expand outwards, and as this one moves this way, and as this one moves this way, they eventually will fuse together, forming no longer two islands, but one large mass of bone. And then finally in step 6, I see that the islands have fused together and started to fill in more and more and more. We do see some gaps, which kind of keeps our bones hollow and a little bit lightweight. And at this point, the bone is fully formed. The only way that this bone will grow at this point is from the edges, where these mesenchyme cells happen to be located. So when we go through bone remodeling, our bones can get denser or weaker, just kind of depending on use. And if we expose them to physical stress and strain, they'll get thicker. These mesenchyme cells would make this bone expand outward and outward. The second type of ossification that we looked at was endochondral ossification, which is how long bones form. So we're looking now at the formation of long bones, and we can see that we definitely have hyaline cartilage, a cartilage kind of as a model. And that's exactly what the first step says, is we have this cartilage model, and we see a collar start to form kind of around the perimeter of it. That collar is made up of a bone tissue, hence it's called the bone collar. And we can also see in here we have a primary ossification center. We know ossification is the formation of bone tissue. So this must be the main area where bone becomes made. Moving to step 2, we can see that the bone has expanded and grown in length a little bit. Still see that bone collar there. But we start to see cavitation of the hyaline cartilage within the cartilage model. Cavitation is the formation of a cavity or a hole in our body, just like cavities in our teeth are holes. Recall that we have the medullary cavity that makes up the innermost region of our bones. So we definitely need that cavity to form. We can see here it's kind of completely filled in with cartilage, so we need to form that cavity. So we'll have bone form and then kind of start to create that cavity by breaking down the cartilage that happens to be found in that region. Next, we'll start to have more cavities forming and increasing in length. We can see that spongy bone is forming inside. Recall that the innermost region of bone is kind of the medullary cavity, but then there's spongy bone, and then the outer layer would be compact bone and also the periosteum. So we can see a blood vessel supplying the growth of our bone, nourishing our cells that are going through the ossification process. And then we start to continue to grow and expand. Moving even further along, we can see that the bone has expanded outwards from the main region, which was our primary ossification center. So the primary meaning first. This was the first region in the middle here to ossify, but now we're starting to see ossification centers arise in the epiphysis of the long bones, or the ends. These come after the formation of the middle, so these would be our secondary centers. Once again, have a blood supply to nourish those cells that are actively growing, forming new bone tissue. And then our last step of the bone forming, we can definitely see that the cartilage has continued to become ossified, with the exception of the ends of the epiphysis known as the epiphyseal plate. The epiphyseal plate remains cartilage, and it's also known as our growth plate. This would be like what a bone looks like at birth, but at birth we still need to grow in height, and it is from these epiphyseal plates that we are allowed to continue that growth after we have been born. And that kind of goes into the ossification 2 picture that we'll be looking at next, which let's just scroll down and take a look. So now at this point, we're looking at how growth continues after birth at the epiphyseal plate. So what we see going on here is a little blow up, following this arrow, of what this epiphyseal plate would look like. We can see that there are chondrocytes, which the question down at the bottom here, first one, identifies them as being cartilage cells. These cartilage cells go through a process starting from the middle and expanding downwards or upwards, just kind of depending, usually downwards because our bones are getting longer. And we can see that these chondrocytes go through different zones. They go through a proliferating zone, a zone of hypertrophy, a calcification stage, followed by an ossification stage. Now, we already know that ossification means formation of bone, so hopefully when we look at ossification zone, we can start to deduce that at this place right here, these cartilage cells, the chondrocytes, they are now becoming bone. So they start to go through a series of processes, a series of changes where they are, essentially being born, or they're proliferating. They start to age. They start to calcify, and then they start to ossify, forming that new bone. And as the new bone is forming, the diaphysis gets longer, we get taller. Again, if you were stuck on any of these questions, hopefully the explanations that I provided over these images was beneficial to you in some way, shape, or form. Definitely reach out to me if you feel like you have questions or concerns or something's just not clicking. Relative to your assignment, where I'm looking for you to create 2 flowchart diagrams illustrating the processes of both endochondral ossification and intramembranous ossification. The explanations provided to you in this would certainly be of assistance, so use them if you like.